Hi everyone, great to see that so many of you are here. Welcome to this Radboud Reflects lecture on a passion for ignorance, what we choose not to know and why. My name is Nina de Boer, I'm a philosopher and I'll be tonight's moderator. So the topic that we're discussing tonight is ignorance, and specifically ignorance in relation to the pandemic. And I started off last year by frantically scrolling through all the news apps I had on my phone to check in with the latest developments on how the virus was spreading, new cases, expert opinions. And at some point I noticed I just got very overwhelmed by all the information that I was taking in. And I decided to actively cut back on my news intake. But I felt justified to do this, to remain a bit more ignorant of what was happening in the world. But how to actually draw this line between ignorance that is good as a self-protective mechanism and ignorance that is bad or that can have negative consequences for you or for the world at large. And what if people in power make use of structural ignorance to either refrain from telling people what is happening in the world, or by actively denying what is taking place? So these are very important and relevant questions that we're going to discuss in tonight's lecture. And we have an amazing speaker who's going to tell us all about it. But before I introduce her, a couple of practicalities. So first, this lecture will start off by a lecture by the speaker, and afterwards there will be room for discussion. And you can participate in this discussion by sending in your questions via menti.com. And here on the screen you now see the website you can go to and the code you can fill in. I can then pick a couple of questions during the discussion that I can then pose to the speaker. Please keep your questions short and concise. And if you feel more comfortable to ask them in Dutch, that's also possible. Then I can translate them. I have my tablets here available and I can see them all. But then without further ado, let me introduce the amazing speaker we have tonight, Professor Renata Salecl. She is a Slovenian philosopher, legal scholar, and a sociologist. And she works at the University of Ljubljana, the University of London, and the London School of Economics. And in her work, she combines psychoanalysis with legal theory and modern political philosophy. And she's written many books, including the book The Tyranny of Choice, on the destructive nature of the overabundance of choices we're currently faced with. The book on anxiety, which is on the age of anxiety that we're currently in and our inability to deal with it. And her latest book, which has the same title as this lecture, A Passion for Ignorance, What We Choose Not to Know and Why. And it's on this notion of ignorance, its benefits and its negative sides, and how it ties into a variety of contemporary issues. So Renata, thank you so much for being here. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to you.
Thank you, Nina. Actually, with your introduction, you already touched like the finale of my book. I was finishing my study of ignorance at the time when the pandemic just started. And a very close friend of mine, an artist who lives in Slovenia, was telling me that he is obsessed with all the information about the pandemic. Like, he was really the most informed person. He knew news from around the world. He knew the scientific development. And then he said, you know, I'm collecting all this information and all this knowledge with the hope that finally I will find the proof that the virus does not exist. So here for me was sort of like a really important point. Now, when you are collecting knowledge, when you have abundance of information, it does not necessarily mean that you are emotionally dealing with this information in the way that you are sort of taking it in, or, you know, in some way digesting it. So a passion for ignorance is the term which French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan actually borrowed from Buddhist scholars. In the 50s, Lacan was taking lessons in Buddhism at Sorbonne. They had some visitors from India, and he liked the idea of ignorance because it connected with what he was observing in his own practice. A lot of people came to him with the desire to know about their suffering, what is behind their symptoms. But he said immediately these people, after they would say, we want to know, they would start doing everything not to know. So behind our desire for knowledge is often a very strong, push, drive to close our eyes, to ignore the truth, to ignore what might be at the core of our suffering. Now, in the book, I look at ignorance in a variety of ways. First, I look at the social aspects. We are speaking that we are living in knowledge-based society, but when we look closely, we see that this is very much, not economy based on knowledge, what we see around us, but as some sociologists have rightly pointed out, kind of an ignorance economy. Now, if we only look at all the machinery linked to copyrights, to trademarks, to sort of the limits to the access of knowledge that we encounter, we can see that knowledge has been in some way privatized and also limited. Now, even us as researchers, we often write in scientific journals which are very hard to access. So you might, publish in scientific journals, but you have difficulty read other articles unless you are at a very good university which has access to, important publications. And of course, we see now with the pandemic all the limitations in sharing of knowledge in regard to the vaccines, in regard to all kinds of other medicines or, other types of scientific knowledge. We see similar obstacles in regards to copyrights, trademarks, and also data. So in my book, I also point out that data, the big data, is very much something that connects with new types of ignorance. On the one hand, we ignore as consumers the fact that data is collected about us, unless we are very skilled, very knowledgeable, unless we read all the small information that is behind our consent. We are constantly giving consent that our data is collected, sold, analyzed without reading it. And some researchers have looked at just the impossibility of understanding and reading the informed consent forms that we are constantly dealing with. Some are saying that we would spend at least half a year reading all the forms that relate to our use of data and the way, in some way, data is collected about us. But on the other hand, we also, in some way, do not understand the mechanisms which are behind the collection of data. Algorithms are opaque. They are in the hands of private companies. Majority of lay people do not understand how they function, but even people who have knowledge do not have access to their formulas. So ignorance is very much driving this, sort of economy which claims to be based on knowledge. Now, even more important are structural mechanisms of ignorance related to how capitalism is functioning today. Corporations very much rely on ignorance, especially when we are dealing with some major disasters. ignorance is very much used as an excuse when, for example, corporations are trying to avoid responsibility. We have seen that many times in the history, let's say when British Petroleum, a little bit over 10 years ago, had the accident in the Gulf of Mexico with the oil spill. They were all pretending in this corporation that they did not know what was happening. Now, of course, the question quite often is whether it is true that the people in the top do not know. Maybe people lower in the hierarchy in the corporation do not inform them. But quite often the case is that people in the top of the corporations are informed, but that they pretend that they do not know. So this kind of structural types of ignorance are at work in the way mechanisms of power are functioning. Now, with the pandemic, we have seen quite a number of structural types of ignorance in this last year. When the pandemic started, China played their own type of sort of structural ignorance. Doctors who were warning the authorities in China were pushed aside, removed from the positions to talk to the media. Their knowledge, their warning was ignored. China was in their own way closing their eyes from the start of the pandemic, but other countries followed. Now, when we embrace ignorance, it might very well be that we create an alternative sort of explanation for our blindness. So many countries denied the impact of the pandemic onto their nation, by claiming that they are somehow superior. We have seen this kind of explanations last year in Turkey, when Turkish President Erdogan was at the beginning of the pandemic, sort of embracing some ideas related to sort of Turks being, maybe a stronger nation. Media very closely related to Erdogan in Turkey was promoting the idea that Turks have a very, distinct genetic make, which makes them more immune to the pandemic. Some media were also promoting particular kind of food. Some sheep soup was, praised as potential, boosting thing for their immune system. Even, further in the Arab world, we have seen similar theories. In Jordan, some scientists were writing about Jordanians and Arabs in general having a particular, genetic protection from COVID. We have also seen in Mexico their president claiming that the virus is not affecting them strongly, and encouraging people going to restaurants, living life as normal. Similarly, we have seen in the United States the former President Trump ignoring the pandemic, or in Brazil also President Bolsonaro, even until today, ignoring the pandemic. Now, since in this moment we are witnessing catastrophe in India, we can also read about sort of ignorance being related to this. Since last year, India was not suffering so much from the pandemic. Very quickly, the theory emerged about Indians maybe being, in some particular way protected from the pandemic, maybe because their immune system is stronger. Some of them might have been more exposed to sort of other bacteria or viruses, and that have strengthened their immune system. That was one theory. Many people live outdoors or in very well ventilated houses, and that was sort of another theory. But unfortunately, as we have seen, this kind of types of theories were their own versions of ignorance. Now, with the pandemic, we have also seen very sort of particular type of ignorance related to individuals dealing with their illness. In my book, in one chapter, I deal with health and ignorance. In the 80s, there was quite a lot of research about sort of the psychological mechanisms which are behind individual ignorance when they are dealing with life-threatening illness. An Israeli psychologist, Shlomo Brezhnitz, in the 80s did a very interesting study among coronary patients. He observed among people who have just suffered heart attack and they were, in the hospital because of it, all kinds of ignorance related to the possibility that they might experience a repeat attack. He calculated kind of 7 different types of deniers among his patients. When the patients were in the hospitals, they observed some other patients having a repeat heart attack, but many of these patients did not think that something like this could happen to them. So there was like kind of a denial related to what is happening to others cannot happen to me. Now, there are many theories of what protects an individual from a repeat heart attack or any other illness. Some thought that they are sort of protected by the way that they have changed their lifestyle. They are exercising, they're eating healthy. Some were denying the possibility by sort of claiming that, what has happened to others in no way can happen to them. Many others were denying sort of like the emotional impact. So they understood the danger. They thought, yes, it could happen to me, but they've sort of protected themselves from this information by sort of feeling as if, sort of the emotions, the anxiety related to the attack that, that are kind of normal that a person feels, actually are not pertaining, not something that affects them. So they had kind of a detached attitude towards the illness. Many, in some way denied the information. What doctors told them, they denied. But others, understood the information. However, they denied the emotional impact that this information could have to them. Now, some people also created delusions. They created, sort of psychotic-like theories about what is happening to them. Now, with the current pandemic, we observe very similar type of deniers. Some people have, a lot of information about the pandemic, but they behave as if, the coronavirus, the infection, cannot touch them. Some people might feel that they are protected because they are exercising a lot, they are living very healthy. Some very similar to Brezhnitz's patients believe that what is happening to others cannot happen to them. Some have sort of like the lack of urgency, like when they are experiencing some symptoms related to their health, they delay seeking help, as if, they don't want to notice, sort of like what is happening in their body. Now, still, other people sort of deny the illness in the way that they perceive that illness is just a matter of luck or fate or destiny. And moreover, other people in a way deny kind of the affects. Even with COVID, we see very similar things that Brezhnev observed with his coronary patients, that people deny their emotions related to the condition in which they are, and they transfer their anxiety to other causes. They might sort of completely negate this affect that they experience. And even with COVID, we also observe some kind of psychotic delusions. So some psychiatrists have, observed that people are creating delusions also about them being protected from the virus. In Germany, psychiatrists have been written about cases of delusion. An interesting case was a man who felt that his phone got infected by a Chinese computer virus. And in his mind, this infection of the phone was actually protecting him to be infected from coronavirus. Now, when we observe this kind of denials on the side of the individuals, we have to see that ignorance and denial and also negation might be very helpful for people. So in my book, I'm not taking ignorance as a negative thing, as something that, is sort of kind of looked down at. Quite often, we take ignorance as something negative. We often accuse other people of being ignorant, and we have sort of problem dealing with our own sort of strategies of closing our eyes, denying or negating. My point is that ignorance can be at least temporarily beneficial for the subject. There are some moments where ignorance allows us to kind of go on, to at least temporarily sort of kind of overcome a certain situation, or somehow ignorance might be linked to desperate attempt of the subject to survive. When people have been extremely traumatized, let's say that they have been victims of violence, war, or other type of trauma, for some of these people, ignoring what has happened to them, denying it, pushing it aside, pushing the traumatic memory out of their consciousness, at least temporarily allows them to hold on, to hold themselves together. Which is why psychoanalysts would not want to sort of force knowledge onto their patients. They would allow their patient, the analysants, to work through in their own pace and sort of deal with traumatic knowledge, traumatic truth in their own time. Now, overwhelmingly present are denials which are sort of kind of linked to unpleasant information, or information that is steering unpleasant emotions. Now, with the pandemic, we can see that this kind of, deniers or ignorances are, continuing. Now we are in times when, at least in the developed world, quite a lot of people have the possibility to get vaccinated, or there is like an increased possibility to vaccinate. And here too, we can see ignorance, denial, or sort of negation at work. Now, when psychologists are dealing with these kinds of denial, they are, usually pointing out that it is useless to throw more knowledge at people who are in the grip of denial or ignorance. Let's say if we take an example of vaccination, quite often, we are not sort of convincing people who are against vaccination with more knowledge or more information about why vaccination might be helpful for them and society as such. There are, a couple of strategies that psychologists are, promoting how to deal with people who are resistant to vaccination. One is, one should not put all people who have expressed doubt about vaccination into the same sort of like group. While, some are, completely convinced that vaccination is dangerous, majority of people just are in their own way dealing with doubts. They're sort of in their own way dealing with the information about vaccination, which is why they are often called, vaccine hesitant people and not anti-vaxxers. Some research points that there are maybe only, like up to 5% people in society who might be passionate anti-vaxxers, and the majority of others who are questioning vaccines might be just hesitants. Now, and this second group can change their mind. However, in the communication with them, it is important to understand sort of their cognitive biases, the mechanism that is driving their hesitancy. Some people are suffering from casual illusions where, they can easily connect sort of cause and effect. Others might be, dealing with the problem of confirmation bias, where, they kind of are, overwhelmed with the facts, with theories, which are constantly confirming their views. And since we live more and more in kind of information bubbles, this is happening, quite a lot with us. And quite a lot of us also, are dealing with the illusion of the explanatory depth bias, which means that we think that kind of we know more than we do. So when I'm sort of speaking about the pandemic, I want to point out that, in some way with the pandemic, we are dealing with ignorance, doubt, strategic also ignorance, but also like an individual ignorance, which is not so different from the type of ignorances that we have dealt before. Now, in the conclusion, I want to just point out a couple of things. In my book, I have looked at three things. One is sort of the structural, social dimension of ignorance, the way the power structures rely on keeping people in the dark. Big data, for example, would be one example. The second thing I looked at is individual passion for ignorance. Our sort of unconscious mechanisms are often blocking us to sort of deal with truth, with facts. We can easily, of course, be influenced by what others are thinking, but especially because emotions are playing such an important role when we are dealing with knowledge and facts. Now, the third thing I looked at is the fact that more and more people today feel that they are ignored. Now, what has happened in today's times in the neoliberal society is that people are kind of changing their relationships to authorities. There has been a change in intersubjective relationships, and more people have the experience that on the one hand, no one is in charge, which might not be such a bad thing, since the old authorities, like state leaders or even, parents or church leaders, have been, quite problematic authorities sometimes. So I'm not claiming that with society with traditional authorities was maybe a happier society, but we need to acknowledge that there happened to be a change in the way authorities are regarded, how they function, and whether they still want to be authorities. Many parents don't want to be traditional authorities anymore. And also with the individualization of society, with this turn also to, the tyranny of choice, which I spoke about in my previous book, we also observe with the individuals constant feeling that no one notices them, that they are not observed, that other people are not, acknowledging them. And this steers particular kind of feelings which are adding to new types of ignorance that we can observe today. And just as my kind of final point, I want to point out that one of the questions that I'm dealing at the very end of the book is, the question of what is the passion behind not only our kind of embracement of conspiracy theory or fake news, but let's say our passion to share them, to promote them. Some interesting studies looked at the question of why people are sharing fake news or conspiracy theories. And their surprise answer was that many people who are sharing these theories do not believe in them. But why would someone share conspiracy theory or fake news when he or she does not believe in it? There is an emotional gain. The first gain is that we are getting recognition from our community. Let's say that we are part of a certain conspiracy community, and when we are successfully sharing some conspiracy theory, when we get a lot of likes, shares, or other types of recognition, we do get a certain kind of an emotional gain in our community. But the other emotional gain that we get is when we are steering emotions in other people. Let's say when we are steering emotion in our opponents, people who disagree with us, when they express anger, when they are upset, surprisingly, we gain some kind of a recognition too. So when we want to analyze contemporary society, we should not forget, the intricate sort of level of affects, emotions, the power of the unconscious, and we should sort of not forget that, with more information, we do not necessarily get, sort of kind of more of a passion for knowledge, but actually we might observe an increase in ignorance. Thank you.
Renata, thank you so much for this enlightening presentation. And there's a lot of topics that you discussed that I would like to delve a bit more into. And the last one, or the first point that I want to make, the first question I have for you relates to the notion of ignorance and the notion of ignoring. Because you, at the start of your talk, you talked about ignorance, and at the end, you also said that people currently feeling ignored is also a major problem. But how are ignorance and ignoring actually related to each other? Are they different things?
They are different things because ignorance, we often relate to knowledge, not only, sort of knowledge as such, but knowledge, the desire to know, so the kind of more traditional theories would claim that ignorance has to do with the lack of the desire to know, not just the lack of knowledge. And when we speak about ignoring, of course, we are in the domain of the intersubjective. But sort of my feeling is that when people feel ignored, and I think that there is quite an increase in that feeling in today's times, that their perception to knowledge also changes. And that's kind of where I'm heading in my book, linking the two. So when you don't see yourself acknowledged, when you are sort of constantly feeling that other people do not notice you, I think that this, contributes to how you relate to knowledge. And that's why in my last example, I'm speaking about the fact that people who are, for example, sharing fake news don't feel that it is necessary that they believe in this knowledge that they are sharing. What is more important for them is, the emotions that they feel, the emotions that they are steering in others.
So they are not exactly the same thing, but they do strongly relate to each other in a way.
They are different. They're very different things, but I think that there is a connection, especially nowadays when with the new social media, let's say likes, shares are almost like a new tax we are paying for friendship. People are very susceptible to how other people are sort of relating to what they are sharing online. And this recognition that they are getting, or the lack of recognition they are getting, very much influences them. And when you are sharing some information that stirs a lot of a lot of emotions, is shared a lot, is liked a lot, I think that this recognition that you're getting contributes to how you sort of interact and, sort of what kind of further information or disinformation you want to share with others.
Yeah, because that ties in with another point that you raised during the talk, namely this idea of people sort of, I don't think you explicitly mentioned the term echo chamber, but that people sometimes that it's bad for people when people have doubts about certain things, for example, vaccination or their belief in the existence of a virus even, that it's they're not really good if they're all together in the same space, that they can maybe reinforce their beliefs. But indeed, things like social media have made it very easy for these kind of situations to happen. And is it then still possible to sort of combat this ignorance once it has come to such a point that there is such a close group of people who feel a certain way?
Combating it is very difficult unless we address the emotions which are behind. In echo chambers, people are fed information that kind of confirms their existing beliefs. And it is as if, a child who likes eating sweets would constantly get sweets only from his parents, no other presumably healthy food. So I don't think we can battle with these echo chambers in the way that we are throwing more information at people or trying to convince them otherwise. So first would be addressing their emotions and maybe, increasing their doubt. Now, in psychoanalysis, we know that it is really important that people are full of doubt. When people do not have doubt, we might deal with people who have a structure of psychosis, people who have certainty about, that they are observed or that someone is surveying them or whatever, might have a kind of a particular, delusions which are impossible to crack. So, the first step would be to try to, encourage people to look a little bit at other information and to sort of increase their doubt. Any serious scientist knows the value of doubt. And kind of, even when we deal with vaccines or with virus, there is nothing wrong to have doubt about it. It is just, the question of, whether we are willing to look at informations in the way that, we get as many viewpoints as possible, or we're kind of enclosing ourselves into the small echo chambers and we feel better about our already existing beliefs.
But that's an interesting point that you raised, that indeed it would be good for us, for society in general, if people maybe would embrace doubt a bit more. And this maybe also ties in with the claims you made before, that we're like in this knowledge economy and we feel that, we need to know everything. But then when you say that we have to embrace doubting a bit more, or maybe embracing the fact that we don't know certain things, where do we then draw this line between, okay, well, these are things that I just stay away from knowing more about, also because it may make me feel better, but also other things where I actually should have more information on. So can we make this decision between sort of good and bad ignorance in specific cases?
I think it would be difficult to speak about good and bad ignorance. As I said before, for some people, ignorance might be life-saving, and we would not fall in love without at least a little bit of ignorance. So even to keep our desire, emotional, romantic sort of feelings alive in love matters, in particular, closing our eyes, ignoring some things might be quite essential. Also in our intersubjective relationships, sometimes ignoring someone might be helpful. We are teaching parents to use time out, which is like a form of ignorance when they are, kind of dealing with naughty children. So intersubjectively, we use ignorance in terms of, the second term, which I'm speaking about in my book, like the intersubjective term of ignoring. But I think that in regards to information, we are living truly in the time of massive amount of information. However, if we don't sort of embrace doubt in regard to what search engines are presenting us, if we don't know about sort of the algorithms which are behind the knowledge which is sort of presented to us, then unfortunately, we are kind of living in the echo chambers which we spoke about before, which is why it's so important for us to understand sort of like the basics of the big data or the algorithm, at least kind of like the basic behind it. And for us, also another problem is that we quite often escape anxiety when, let's say, when we are dealing with some information that is hard to crack. Quite often we feel anxiety. Let's say when you don't understand something, when you're trying to read a very difficult text, for example, you experience a certain kind of anxiety in regard to this knowledge. Now, today, the danger is that we can easily escape this anxiety and, go search for answers very quickly online, which might be an obstacle to deal with sort of like important questions, which is why, we need to sometimes endure certain anxiety which is related to our lack of knowledge, or at least sort of a kind of an anxiety which is related to the impossibility to know. Now, the medieval philosopher Nicholas de Cusa was speaking about learned ignorance. His idea was that there are, things that we cannot know, and sort of understanding, the lack of our knowledge or the impossibility to know is maybe like the first step to overcome ignorance.
Could you specify that a bit further then? Because indeed, it seems to me indeed like if I have a question and I don't know it, it's indeed like for me it's a very logical first step to then Google something, example. But do you think that there's something bad in, or not necessarily bad, but that it would be helpful not to then have that knowledge to feel a bit more comfortable with this doubt, or that it in general would be good if we would not take so much information in as we currently do?
Yeah, they're like just what I do sometimes is I have like an important kind of question I'm dealing with. I look through two search engines. If I look through Google, I will get one set of answers, on the top of my list. And if I look at DuckDuckGo, which is my preferred search engine, I would get completely different sort of like type of information. At least the hierarchy of how the information will come to me will be completely different. So sometimes it's good to look, a little bit broader, because Google or, other search engines might very well remember your patterns of search, which is why even, people who are buying flight tickets are smart to hide their previous searches, or, use different computers or whatever, to get different results. That's kind of just like, I would say the basic of it. And, just with really difficult questions, enduring some of the anxiety, staying a little bit with your anxiety, with your lack of knowledge, might open up new avenues. I remember, when I was a student, we didn't have yet these possibilities of searches. And when I was dealing with really difficult book of Kant's theory of practical reason, being 18 years old, I remember tremendous anxiety. And, just the way I went was like, what I did was, since there was no Google, was just like read a couple of times this really, difficult book, and then, some light emerged somewhere, at least enough light so that I passed the exam.
Okay, so that's at least one tip we can take away from this lecture, to if we feel the urge to Google something, then maybe for a bit refrain from that and see what comes out of it. I was you saw maybe
or use two search engines.
Okay, fair point. Yeah, I saw maybe you saw that my screen lit up. That's because I received all the questions from Mentimeter, and I saw that a lot of questions came in. And let me see. So there is one person who asks, is religion also a form of ignorance, or can it be helpful to accept truth about things that frighten us?
To say that it can be helpful, I think it's very individual. You know, if someone is so frightened, so in the grips of anxiety, which is different than fear. Quite often with fear, we know what we are afraid of. When we're under the grips of anxiety, quite often we cannot easily point out what we are anxious about. It might not be helpful to throw at the person, knowledge, or, sort of convince him or her that his or her anxiety is pointless. So unless the person in his own way, on his own time, figures out, how to deal with anxiety, I don't think anyone outside of him or her can easily appease his or her anxiety. Whether religion is linked to ignorance, I think that here it's something one cannot easily answer, because religion is not only a set of beliefs, but we could say also very important, strong emotions behind it. So I would say that in the universe of a religious person, things, stand differently than in the universe of a person who is not religious, and which is why I would not want to use the term ignorance being associated with religious beliefs. They're different, let's say, views of our life, universe, different perceptions of knowledge, and for some people it might be, also emotionally very helpful, beneficial, if they have the strong beliefs, and while for others it might not.
So it really depends on the person and if they
and
feel that religion works for them. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Let's see. Okay, this is a nice question. So if you could choose, would you want to be more intelligent and more knowledgeable, or rather far less intelligent and more ignorant about the world? So is ignorance bliss?
Sometimes it is. It might be. Not only for less intelligent people, but also for very intelligent people. In my book, I give an example of the woman who is super intelligent, one of the sort of like Mensa person in the United States, presumably with one of the highest IQ. And I read an interview with her, and she was asked how come that she never sort of like made it in the way that she didn't become like a top scientist or something in her life with such incredible IQ. And she said that actually her problem is that she is not able to ignore things, that she has a massive amount of information about a lot of things. She's memorizing so many things, but she is not able to make a hierarchy, and she's not able to choose what's really important, what isn't. So she's not able to close her eyes to the trivia or some less important information that she's memorizing. So she could not specialize. So when we specialize in some way, we kind of focus on something and we ignore quite a lot of other things.
It is what is interesting is to this. So you say that she had sort of a trouble in that sense becoming successful because she did not specialize in that sense. But there's also now in society this call for people who are more generalists, so who know more about a lot of different subjects. But does that then not run counter to this idea that sometimes it's good not to know something about a certain topic?
Yeah, I should sort of correct myself in a little bit. Successful, it's a kind of a term that I don't want to embrace too much, like a successful for whom. I just want to say more like a kind of specializing in pursuing one particular path, a particular kind of a career, let's say a particular scientific career or whatever. And with the example of this woman, it is just that she was passionate about memorizing all kinds of things and just could not make almost like a decision of what she wants to really focus on.
So this again, like it's not always the case that more is better. I think what we can then take away from that. So let's see what other people came in, or what other questions were being asked. Here someone asks, do you think a capitalist society can exist without structural ignorance about things such as pollution, harm done to animals, or child labor?
No, I don't think it can easily survive. Structural, systemic kind of ignorance is at the core of capitalist society. Not only, sort of like the examples that the person mentioned, but, kind of the very fact that we are sort of like pursuing the idea of development, the idea of success, that we are sort of also kind of ignoring kind of the future, I would say, when we are in the throes of production, success, profit, all this, what is guiding a capitalist society, we're very much sort of ignoring what will happen with the next generations, or what will be the consequences of this push for profit and push for development that is sort of like the mantra of our capitalist society.
So would you then say it's also sort of inherent in power or in power dynamics that some people are more ignorant than others?
A British sociologist, Lindsay McGoey, has written wonderfully about sort of like the structural ignorance, which is sort of part of capitalist society, how corporations are sort of embracing it. And let's say we have seen not only in regards to ecological issues, but, in the past, let's say, many studies have shown that ignorance, doubt, and sort of doubt have been kind of being used together when, for example, corporations were trying to prevent people to know what might be side effects of what they're promoting. Let's say tobacco industry. Tobacco industry has decades ago played first on ignorance, the idea that they don't know what might be the side effect of smoking, but then the next step was increasing also doubt when scientists have proved in many ways the danger of smoking. The strategy was to sort of increase doubt in regard to scientific knowledge. And that was the same kind of a playbook that was sort of used in regard to climate change, to keep sort of doubt alive, even when, facts, scientific knowledge has been, kind of proving, the connection sort of between our lifestyle and, sort of climate change.
But how to then, as an individual, like knowing all these things and knowing that there's also misinformation out there, how do we then decide what to believe and what not to believe? Does this mean that we should always distrust the companies or the people in power?
Yes, doubt, distrust, criticism is essential, especially in regards to people in power, not only individual people in power, but, corporations. But then, when we are, sort of dealing with scientific knowledge, a point comes where, something should be believed. So I'm not encouraging, total relativism in regard to everything. There are definitely points where, we as individuals should trust some knowledge, some, scientific fact, some truth, and, at least temporarily embrace, some information that comes to us. Of course, it is very essential that, we try to understand where the information is coming from, and of course get, many different points of view.
So keep a healthy dose of distrust. And so I will then look at the rest of the questions. Again, thanks everyone for all the questions that you put in. Unfortunately, I don't have time to cover all of them. Let's see. There's many questions coming in that I don't know which one to choose. I think a question that I see here is, why do so many people remain ignorant about climate change? Why is it so difficult to accept its truth?
Yeah, here the emotions are again playing a really important role. Quite often it appears very abstract, unless, issues related to climate change touch us individually. Let's say that we are dealing with unhealthy environment around us, or contaminated water. Climate change is often something abstract for us. For a lot of people, it appears, something that might not individually necessarily at this point touch their lives, or they cannot easily see how it does touch their lives, which is why, it is so easy to ignore for people, just like general problems of climate change. I remember there has been some really interesting study about Norwegian society. Norwegian sociologist who works in the United States, Maar, did a study a couple of years ago about sort of like how Norwegians in some small towns relate to issues of climate change. And, quite a lot of people felt individually that they are lovers of nature, they want to have clean environment and so on. But, as sort of like social beings in their community or in their state, they have not been doing much, or they have not been pushing much for sort of like changes in regards to, how their country was dealing with climate change, because they knew that their economic success relies on oil industry. This was done about 10 years ago when, Norway was not making, kind of yet such important steps that they are trying to do nowadays, to invest, money in clean energy and so on. And so people have had a lot of fear that their well-being, that the richness of their country will be diminished if there are global changes in regards to fossil fuels. So you could love nature, you can be very attentive to the issues of ecology in your private life, but publicly you might be quiet or you might ignore because of the fear that your idea of progress or the well-being of your society might not continue in the future if society deals more rigorously with the issues of climate change.
So again, this notion of fear that comes in our decision to stay ignorant, yes or no. I think there's time for one more question. This question, this person states, the fact that some people know know much information but pretend as if they don't know is a matter of strategic ignorance. But how can you distinguish strategic ignorance from normal ignorance?
Yeah, strategic ignorance is often linked to power. So we can observe it in the way corporations are keeping in dark, the population in regard to their practices. This is quite often sort of the case, especially when they are polluting, or when their practices involve all kinds of let's say questionable things. So this is like a strategic ignorance. Now, normal ignorance is a difficult term. I don't think there exists something like a kind of a normal ignorance. I would say that for the individual, as I said before, ignorance might be a way, in the way he or she deals with something that he cannot easily comprehend. That might be like kind of a normal ignorance on an individual basis. But in regards to, let's say, society as such, the kind of the attitude towards knowledge, whether the pursuit for knowledge is encouraged or not, that might be kind of another way where we deal with sort of normal ignorance. Let's say Donald Trump was a president who, in a way, encouraged, I would say, certain kind of ignorance. And what was his strength was also that he had no shame, or did not kind of express shame in regard to his ignorance. It might be that we feel shame or guilt in regard to our lack of knowledge, but when we don't feel that, ignorance is more easily, I would say, normalized than it would be otherwise.
So maybe as a last question to wrap all of this up, because you in your lecture you sketched quite a lot of problematic points with respect to ignorance and how people have been misinformed in relation to the pandemic, etc. Do you think that could you maybe let's not hope that there will be another pandemic, but will there, like, from the way that this situation has developed and the problems you've seen with people being misinformed, etc., what will be your recommendation for the future for individuals, or is there anything positive in that sense with respect to this idea of ignorance that came out of this period?
since we are still in the grips of the pandemic, the thing we should take out of this pandemic is that there will be other pandemics in the future, and that is why this pandemic should be taken as a wake-up call on a variety of levels in the countries, individual states, the importance of strengthening public health system, the sort of kind of global problem of climate change and the intervention into nature has been very much linked to the problems with viruses, and we might in the future experience more of them. So I would say that this pandemic has opened up many things about knowledge. We are constantly hearing what we don't know. About the virus, we still don't know much. We don't know yet how the vaccines will pan out. Although a majority of scientists are sort of, let's say, convincing us that they are safe, and I very much hope that they are safe. There are still some unknowns about them, and they appear to be, let's say, less dangerous than some think. So, which is why I myself embrace vaccination, but we should not deny some unknowns about the vaccinations, also about the virus, and also understand that in the future we might experience more of these pandemics, which is why we need to rethink the organization of our societies, the whole idea of progress, the idea about sort of like cooperation in globally, since we know that if we are solving pandemic in one country, we are actually not solving it, because if we are not solving it globally, we have not sort of like done much to get out of this mess. So I would say that ignorance in regards to the pandemic is not something to be embraced. It is better to sort of prepare ourselves to search for more knowledge, more understanding, and also, let's say, to imagine a society of the future which can cope with the future pandemics better than we have coped with this one.
Well, thank you for this last bit of advice, Renata, and thank you for this amazing lecture and for the great discussion afterwards. And it was really a pleasure for me, and I can imagine it was the same for everyone listening.
Thank you.
I want to thank you. And I also want to thank the public and everyone who's watching at home for joining us and for being so active in asking all these questions. And it was very much a pleasure. And we hope to see you back soon for another lecture of Radboud Reflects.